In the early streets of America, before the Civil War, before freedom was law, there was a terror that didn't wear uniforms. It didn't march under a flag. It came as neighbors, shopkeepers, churchgoers, fathers, and when night fell, they gathered in mobs burning presses, dragging men through streets, destroying voices that dared to say one forbidden word: abolition. This is not a story of war. This is a story of crowds, of rage, of fear weaponized. Because long before slavery ended, abolitionists were hunted not by governments alone, but by ordinary citizens turned violent. We expose the mob attacks that history tried to forget. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. In the early 1800s, slavery wasn't just legal, it was sacred to the economy. Cotton fed the mills, sugar fed the ports, and human beings fed the profits. To challenge slavery was not just to challenge morality. It was to threaten wealth, status, and power. Abolitionists weren't seen as reformers, they were seen as destroyers. The abolitionists are seen as the enemy. Newspapers called them traitors, fanatics, and insurrectionists. Rumors spread, they want slave revolts. They want interracial marriage. They want to destroy the Union. Fear moved faster than truth, and fear created mobs. There was no social media. But there were taverns, churches, and town halls. Newspaper headlines screaming danger. One meeting turned into whispers, whispers turned into crowds, and crowds turned into violence, and once the first window shattered, no one wanted to be the first to stop. In many cities, police stood aside, militias refused to intervene. Judges blamed the victims. Why? Because many officials agreed with the mob. There was an unspoken law in America: you may speak freely, unless you speak against slavery. Break that rule and the mob would come. Torches were lit, printing presses were smashed. Houses were marked. Abolitionists slept with boots on. Some kept pistols under pillows. Many fled in the dark and some never escaped. In 1837, one man refused to run. He stood beside his printing press as a mob gathered. And when the shots rang out, America crossed a line it could never undo. The streets were quiet, but only on the surface. Behind closed doors, whispers swirled like smoke. Fear was no longer contained to the plantations, it had seeped into the cities, and in these northern towns, abolitionists dared to speak. The first mobs were not spontaneous. They were organized, deliberate, and fueled by terror. Merchants, dockworkers, even clergymen and women who had never seen battle were drawn together by a shared hatred. Abolitionist newspapers were the first targets. Their presses shattered, pages burned before the ink even dried. Pamphlets calling for freedom were torn and thrown into the streets. Every word is a threat. Every letter is an invitation for vengeance. In Philadelphia, a mob dragged William Lloyd Garrison's printed words through the dirt. In New York, anti-abolitionists stormed churches, claiming the sermons themselves were dangerous. Crowds do not act like individuals. Fear multiplies, rage compounds, and when anonymity cloaks the soul, morality disappears. Ordinary men became hunters. Ordinary women became spectators. Ordinary citizens became executioners of words. No one was safe. A printer. A minister. A schoolteacher. Even children felt the tremor of hate marching through their streets. There was always a warning. Leaflets nailed to doors. Threatening letters slid under the cracks of windows. Leave the city or die. And yet, some did not leave. Some refused. Their courage would light the fires of history, and sometimes, extinguish their lives. The first riots were mostly property, broken presses, burned pamphlets, but soon, blood would stain the streets. A young printer in Boston tried to defend his press, the mob overwhelmed him, the city watched, and the world began to understand, in the fight against slavery, words could be lethal. Crowd shouting in crescendo, then silence, and this was only the beginning. In a world without television or radio, the printed word was a weapon. A single pamphlet could ignite debate, expose injustice, or challenge the pillars of power into the anti-abolitionist mob. That power was unacceptable. Every sheet of paper calling for freedom was a spark in a powder keg. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York became hunting grounds. The presses of William Lloyd Garrison, Benjamin Lundy, and other abolitionists were repeatedly attacked. Broken windows, torn papers, threatening graffiti, and it was never just property damage. One mob in Boston threw a press into the street, where it lay like a corpse, twisted metal and scattered ink marking a warning to anyone who dared to speak. Printers became soldiers. Ink-stained hands clutching wooden mallets and sometimes pistols. Every day was a gamble between creation and destruction. And yet, each attack only strengthened the abolitionists' resolve. The more the mob destroyed, the louder their voices became. In 1837, the violence turned deadly. Elijah Lovejoy, a printer in Alton, Illinois, refused to be silenced. His presses had been destroyed 3 times, but he rebuilt them. The 4th time, the mob came with guns. Shots rang out, the press fell, and Lovejoy did not survive. The first abolitionist martyr was born not from debate, not from law, but from mob violence. Across America, the news spread like wildfire: fear, rage, and inspiration. The message of the mobs was clear: freedom of speech had limits. Challenge slavery and you risk fire, mob justice, and death. Yet abolitionists continued to print, to speak, to resist. Every destroyed press became a symbol of resistance, a warning, and a rallying cry all at once. And so the presses kept turning, but each night, the mobs watched. Every alley, every doorway, every whisper in the dark is a potential threat. In these streets of ink and fire, America learned a brutal lesson: some truths were so dangerous that ordinary citizens would kill to stop them. Boston, once a beacon of liberty, had become a city on edge. Its cobblestone streets hid fear, resentment, and fury. In the heart of this tension stood William Lloyd Garrison, a man with words as sharp as blades, calling for the immediate abolition of slavery. To the anti-abolitionist mob, he was no reformer, he was a threat to society itself. Crowds gathered not for justice, but for spectacle. Torches lit the night as mobs chanted threats. Signs of warning nailed to doors: stop preaching freedom or face the consequences. In Boston, the mob's eyes were everywhere, and when anger met opportunity, chaos followed. The mob's anger reached a breaking point. They surrounded Garrison's press, dragging ropes across the cobblestones. The threat was clear: destroy the press, or die, and yet, Garrison did not yield. He stood firm as the mob surged, chanting, hurling stones, threatening fire. Each wave of attack was both warning and punishment. Each shattered window was a reminder: freedom had a price. And Boston watched. Citizens peered from windows, some hid, some cheered, and some joined the mob. The line between observer and participant blurred. No one could claim innocence, and the city itself became complicit in the violence. Stones shattered glass, torches licked at timbers, and in the center of it all, the printing press groaned under the assault. The mob's message was brutal and simple: speak against slavery, and we will find you. But for every page torn, Garrison printed 2 more. For every attack, he refused to bow. Boston's streets bore the scars of rage. Windows replaced, walls patched, but the fear lingered. And the message was clear: mobs could destroy property. They could intimidate the timid, but they could not silence the unflinching voice of conviction. And as night fell over the city, the flames of hatred burned not just in buildings, but in the hearts of men who feared change. Philadelphia, the city of liberty, once celebrated for its ideals, now trembled under the weight of fear. The growing abolitionist movement had stoked resentment among its citizens. Economic anxiety, racial prejudice, and rumors of insurrection converged to form a perfect storm, and in the streets, the mobs waited. Abolitionist churches were the first to feel the rage. Houses of worship, symbols of hope, became battlegrounds. Windows smashed, doors kicked in, flames licking at wooden pews. Ministers and parishioners dragged into the night, threatened for preaching against slavery. In the eyes of the mob, faith aligned with abolition was treason. The mob's fury did not stop at property. Entire black neighborhoods were terrorized. Families forced from their homes. Shops looted. Children hiding in attics, praying to survive the night. Philadelphia's streets became a theater of fear. Every step outside could invite violence. And yet, the violence was public, no one intervened. Police often stood by. City leaders turned a blind eye. The mobs were not mindless. They were strategic. Attacks came at night, when visibility was low. Leaders whispered instructions. Ordinary citizens were coerced to join, or watch, or at least stay silent, and the message was terrifyingly clear: oppose us, and you will burn. Stand with abolitionists, and you burn with them. Some survived by fleeing. Others hid for days, only emerging to find homes destroyed, businesses looted, and lives upended. And yet, amidst the terror, courage emerged. Secret meetings were held. Underground networks protected the vulnerable. Faith endured. Resistance endured. By morning, the streets of Philadelphia were scarred and silent. Smoke drifted into the dawn. Families counted their losses. The city tried to resume normal life, but the fear lingered. And the mob had left its mark, not just on buildings, but on the hearts and minds of everyone who lived through it. In a society that already sought to confine women to home and hearth, abolitionist women were double threats. They challenged slavery and the rigid rules of gender, and for that, mobs despised them even more fiercely. Their courage drew attention, and attention, in this climate, was deadly. Mobs attacked female abolitionists differently. Threats were personal. Houses were vandalized while women were inside. Stones shattered windows where they worked. Menacing letters warned of rape, kidnapping, and worse. It wasn't just about property, it was about intimidation, humiliation, and control. Despite the danger, women like Angelina Grimke, Lucretia Mott, and countless others refused to hide. They spoke publicly, wrote pamphlets, and organized meetings, even when mobs threatened to tear them from their podiums. Every speech, every article, was a defiance of both slavery and the oppressive violence of men who believed women should stay silent. Mobs employed fear, manipulation, and spectacle. At meetings, stones were thrown. Hallways filled with threatening slogans painted on doors. Men loomed outside windows, waiting for the meeting to end. The message was unmistakable: your voice is dangerous. Stop speaking or face the consequences, and yet, the women persisted. When mobs attacked, they hid presses and pamphlets. They fled and returned, and they inspired their communities to resist. Every act of violence against them became fuel for their courage. Every threat only sharpened their resolve. The mobs sought to silence, humiliate, and terrify, but they failed. The women who survived these attacks laid the groundwork for a movement that would not bend, not break, and not retreat. And in every whispered threat, every broken window, every shattered lamp, the world learned one undeniable truth: courage does not wait for safety, it demands action, even in terror. Part 1: A New Frontier of Violence. Violence in the streets was not enough. The mobs adapted. They turned their attention to the mail, to the very lifeline of abolitionist communication. Letters became weapons, with threats slipped through cracks, under doors, into the hands of those who dared speak for freedom. It was intimate, personal, and terrifying. Part 2: The Threat in Writing. Threatening letters often contained direct warnings of violence, calls for withdrawal from abolitionist activities, threats against family members. Recipients never knew if the threat would remain words or turn into reality. The uncertainty was part of the terror. The postal campaign was methodical. Targets were often prominent abolitionists or anyone suspected of aiding them. Mobs used this quiet violence to spread fear far beyond city streets. No printer, no minister, no organizer, and no one was safe from the reach of the mob. In Boston, letters warned Garrison and his colleagues that their presses would be destroyed and their lives taken if they continued printing. In Philadelphia, black families received warnings of imminent attacks on their homes. Some letters were delivered by night, under the cover of shadows, as the authors hid in alleyways. The message was clear: distance could not protect you. Fear followed you through every letter, every envelope, every word, but abolitionists refused to be silenced. They responded with courage, continuing to write, print, and circulate their materials. Each threatened letter became proof that their words mattered. Every strike of the pen was an act of defiance. Every mailed pamphlet a declaration: fear will not prevail. The postal campaign was more than intimidation, it was psychological warfare. It infiltrated homes, workplaces, and neighborhoods, and it worked. Many activists lived in constant fear. But the very effort to spread terror over distances also revealed the desperation of those who opposed abolition. The mobs could strike from the streets, and now they could strike from afar. Between North and South lay the border states: Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, a region caught in moral, economic, and political tension. Here, abolitionists walked a dangerous line, and mobs patrolled it. In these states, slavery existed legally, but resistance was growing. Every abolitionist pamphlet, every speech, was a provocation. Violence erupted quickly and violently. In towns along the Mississippi, mobs attacked homes of known abolitionists. Windows shattered, furniture destroyed, livestock killed. Families fled at night, hiding under haylofts or in forests, praying the mob would pass, and sometimes, the mob found them. Mobs in the border states did more than attack individuals, they terrorized entire communities. Churches, schools, and meeting halls became battlegrounds. Messages were clear: support abolition at your own peril. Even those sympathetic to abolition were forced into silence. The border was not just geographic, it was moral. Northern abolitionists crossing into these states risked assault, arrest, or worse. Southern sympathizers threatened them with death, and local authorities often looked the other way. In these tense corridors, fear was currency, and mobs spent it freely. A preacher in Kentucky was dragged from his church by a mob and beaten for speaking against slavery. A printer in Missouri had his press thrown into a river. Families were forced to flee across state lines, carrying only what they could. Each act was meant to silence, to intimidate, and to warn others: abolition is a crime in these lands. But abolitionists refused to vanish. Underground networks and sympathetic neighbors provided refuge. Secret meetings continued despite threats, and every act of defiance inflamed the mobs further. In the border states, the battle was not only for freedom, it was for survival itself. In the South, the law often favored the mob. Vigilante groups roamed plantations, towns, and riverbanks. Abolitionists, free black communities, and even allies in the white population faced extreme violence. Here, justice was not blind, it was decisive, brutal, and immediate. Lynch mobs became a tool of terror. Accusations alone could trigger murder. Rumors of aiding abolition or assisting runaway slaves could result in death without trial. Often, victims were hanged publicly, their bodies left as warnings. Entire communities were compelled to watch, or face the same fate. White abolitionists were not spared: houses burned, presses destroyed, families threatened and exiled. The South was a place where the pen could provoke death, and courage often meant risking life itself. Free black communities faced constant terror: vigilante groups raided homes, shops, and churches were burned. Families were abducted or beaten. The message was terrifyingly simple: freedom or defiance would be punished with fire and blood. Local authorities often ignored or even supported the mobs. The sheriffs looked away. Judges dismissed complaints. Militias sometimes participated. Law did not protect the innocent. Only the mob wielded true power. Fear became a daily companion. Abolitionists moved in secret. Black families fortified their homes. Communities whispered warnings through underground networks. And still, some refused to hide. Some resisted openly, knowing the cost could be their lives. The mobs didn't always wait for public confrontations. Sometimes, violence came directly to the doorstep. Abolitionists, free black families, and their allies were kidnapped in the dead of night, beaten, and exiled from towns they had called home for decades. Fear became personal, intimate, inescapable. Exile was a favored tactic of the mob. Families were loaded onto wagons or driven on foot for miles, threatened with death if they returned. Their homes were seized, businesses destroyed, and communities warned, "You will vanish if you resist." Exile was both punishment and warning, sending shockwaves through neighboring towns. Some victims did not leave quietly. Public beatings were staged to terrify communities. Men and women were whipped, dragged through streets, or forced to kneel in humiliation as townsfolk watched. The mob's message: resistance equals pain, silence equals survival. The violence spared few. Women were attacked, threatened, sometimes abducted, simply for being related to or assisting abolitionists. Children hid in attics or basements, learning fear far too early. Terror was designed to be total, psychological, physical, and enduring. And yet, some refused to leave. They rebuilt homes, reopened presses, and continued preaching and organizing. Each act of defiance was both brave and dangerous, and sometimes fatal. Every morning a victory, if they survived. Kidnapping, beating, and exile were not random acts. They were done to control, silence, and terrify. And in many communities, the fear lingered long after the mob dispersed, shaping the behavior and speech of entire populations, and still, abolitionists and their allies persevered. Every act of violence only hardened their resolve. Every threatened life became a testament to courage in the face of relentless hatred. In theory, law and order existed to protect citizens. In practice, in the 1830s and 1840s, politicians and police often turned a blind eye to mob violence. Abolitionists were warned, beaten, and even killed, while officers watched or delayed intervention. Their inaction sent a loud, unmistakable message: if you oppose slavery, the law will not protect you. Some politicians didn't just ignore mobs, they encouraged them. Speeches stoked fear of abolition, calling activists dangerous radicals or traitors to the state. Rioters often felt sanctioned by law, emboldened to escalate attacks. Public officials transformed private rage into organized terror, often under the guise of preserving social order. Police forces were weak, overwhelmed, or sympathetic to the mobs. Calls for protection often went unanswered. Arrests of mob members were rare. Victims were blamed, threatened, or ignored. In many cases, the law became another instrument of fear, rather than a shield against it. In Alton, Illinois, during the attack on Elijah Lovejoy's press, local officials failed to protect him, despite repeated warnings. In Boston, law enforcement hesitated as mobs surrounded abolitionist meetings. In Philadelphia, black neighborhoods were left vulnerable while police watched from a distance. Across cities and towns, the pattern was the same: official neglect amplified the terror. The failure of authorities had a ripple effect: families hid from both mobs and police. Abolitionist presses went underground. Fear governed daily life. Communities learned a harsh lesson: you could not rely on the law to protect justice, yet even in the absence of protection, abolitionists persisted. Secret networks, hidden presses, and underground support systems became lifelines. Courage survived in spite of betrayal. And every act of defiance was a rebuke to both the mob and those sworn to enforce order. In a world where authority failed, bravery became the only shield. Fear is a powerful force. For the anti-abolitionist mob, fear of change, fear of losing social status, and fear of economic collapse fused into collective rage. Ordinary citizens, merchants, farmers, dockworkers, felt their world threatened by a few voices calling for freedom. And fear, when shared by many, becomes terrifyingly contagious. In crowds, individuals act differently than they would alone. Personal morality is diluted, responsibility is diffused. And suddenly, ordinary men and women commit extraordinary acts of violence. Stones thrown. Doors broken. Voices silenced. Alone, they might hesitate. Together, they feel invincible. Sound design, footsteps in unison, distant shouting growing louder, torches clanging against metal. The mob convinces itself that its actions are righteous, necessary, and moral. We are preserving the city. We are defending our homes. We are protecting our way of life. In reality, these were excuses to unleash collective anger. Every act of destruction reinforced the belief that violence was justified. Darkness in numbers provided cover. Individuals could hide in the crowd, act with impunity, and disassociate from the consequences. A stone thrown, a door kicked, a press destroyed, each person could claim they were only one of many. In the mob, identity dissolves, morality dissolves, fear and hate dominate. Peer pressure fueled escalation. Those who hesitated risked shame, exclusion, or even personal attack. Violence became socially enforced and escalation was inevitable. Once one act of aggression occurred, others followed, feeding on each other like wildfire. The mob leaves behind destruction. Homes burned, lives upended, voices silenced, but it also leaves a mark on the participants themselves. Fear, hatred, and justification create a cycle of violence, one that will persist unless courage and conscience intervene. And yet, even in the shadow of this terror, some resisted writing, speaking, hiding, and refusing to be broken. Fear of losing wealth was a powerful motivator. Slavery was not just a social system, it was a profitable enterprise. Merchants, plantation owners, and traders saw abolitionists as a direct threat to their livelihoods, and when money is at stake, violence becomes a tool to protect it. Mobs often justified their attacks by claiming they were defending property and commerce. Abolitionist presses, homes, and stores were seen as threats to economic stability. Destroying them was framed as preserving the city and livelihood. Profit and fear intertwined, creating a justification for terror. Leaders of mobs were often those with the most to lose. Plantation owners, influential businessmen, and even politicians directed violence to protect financial interests. They manipulated crowds, using fear and social pressure to mobilize ordinary citizens into action. The mob became an extension of economic self-interest, wielding bricks, clubs, and fire to protect profit. Economic fear combined with racial prejudice to fuel extraordinary cruelty. Free black communities, abolitionists, and allies were attacked not only for moral opposition to slavery but for threatening the economic order. Fear of financial loss justified violence in the eyes of the perpetrators. Every destroyed press, burned home, or attacked family reinforced the system. Violence protected wealth, wealth funded power, and power ensured the cycle continued. Profit, fear, and hate became inseparable, a triple engine driving the terror against abolitionists. And yet, some refused to be silenced by economic threats. Abolitionists continued to speak, print, and organize, even when the mob threatened financial ruin or death. Courage and conscience became a counterbalance to greed and fear. Every pamphlet printed, every meeting held, was a direct rebuke to the power of money and terror. Religion, meant to guide and comfort, was twisted into a weapon. Anti-abolitionist mobs often claimed moral and spiritual authority for their actions. Preachers and self-proclaimed moral leaders justified violence as defending God's order. Every act of terror was framed as righteousness, sanctioned by faith. Sermons fueled hatred. Ministers preached that abolitionists were radicals, sinners, or threats to social stability. Mobs marched with divine approval, convinced they were carrying out God's will. Religion became both rallying cry and justification. Bibles were cited to defend slavery and demonize abolitionists. Verses were interpreted to claim that the social order must remain, that rebellion against slavery was sinful and punishable. Fear of divine wrath bolstered the mob's confidence, removing moral doubt. Churches themselves were often staging grounds for violence. Sermons inflamed hatred, while congregations were mobilized to attack abolitionist presses, homes, and communities. Faith was weaponized, merging morality and violence into a single, terrifying force. Religious justification reinforced social hierarchies. It allowed ordinary citizens to attack others without questioning conscience. Moral authority became a shield, a divine cover for human cruelty, and for those targeted, abolitionists in black communities, faith was no shield against hatred. Yet, abolitionists also drew strength from faith. Their courage, grounded in conscience and belief in human equality, countered the perversion of religion. Prayer, scripture, and moral conviction became tools of resistance, protection, and resilience. Even when mobs used faith to justify terror, it could not extinguish the moral courage of those fighting for freedom. Violence does not arise from nothing. Rumors and propaganda were the fuel that ignited the anti-abolitionist mob. Ordinary citizens were persuaded to act, to hate, and to destroy, not always by personal grievance, but by words designed to manipulate fear. A single story could spread through a town in hours, morphing with each retelling. Abolitionists were accused of encouraging slave revolts, threatening property and social order, conspiring with outsiders to destabilize communities. Each rumor magnified fear, turning ordinary citizens into instruments of terror. Fear, once planted, grew faster than truth could ever reach. Propaganda provided instructions and justification. Leaflets called citizens to action. Sermons reinforced the narrative. Letters from prominent figures encouraged violent defense of property and tradition. Rumors transformed suspicion into organized, collective violence. People acted not only because they believed the rumors, they acted to avoid social shame. To question the rumor was to risk isolation. To remain passive was to appear weak. The result, an unstoppable momentum of violence. Misinformation turned ordinary citizens into enforcers of terror. Abolitionists in black communities were overwhelmed by misinformation. Innocent actions, publishing a pamphlet, hosting a meeting, educating children were twisted into acts of rebellion. Rumors were a weapon as lethal as clubs or fire, and they spread faster than any law could intervene. Yet, abolitionists persisted. They printed counter-narratives, wrote letters, and organized communities to combat misinformation. Every pamphlet, every speech, was an attempt to pierce the fog of fear. Rumors could inflame mobs, but courage, truth, and solidarity fought to restore humanity. Violence was not random, it had geography. Cities with large abolitionist populations or significant free black communities became the epicenters of mob terror. Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and Cincinnati repeatedly witnessed attacks on homes, presses, and churches. Urban density allowed mobs to assemble quickly and strike efficiently. Border towns like Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were volatile crossroads. Northern abolitionists traveling south, free black families, and merchants sympathetic to emancipation often found themselves trapped between communities divided by fear and loyalty. Geography amplified danger. Rivers, bridges, and isolated roads became channels for violence. In rural plantations and small towns, mob violence took a more personal and intimate form. Families were attacked at home, schools were burned, and neighbors sometimes led the assaults themselves. In these areas, fear spread faster than law, and escape routes were limited. Location also correlated with economic interests. Port cities, river towns, and regions dependent on slave labor or trade were more likely to see organized mob activity. Protecting wealth and property drove violence as much as ideology. Location shaped not only where mobs struck, but how they struck. Geography also offered refuge. Northern rural areas, hidden forests, and sympathetic towns became temporary sanctuaries for fleeing abolitionists and black families. Every geographic feature could be either a barrier or a lifeline. Across the map, a pattern emerges: cities, border towns, and economically strategic areas were frequent targets. Rural areas experienced personal, direct violence. Location did not just influence where terror occurred, it shaped the intensity and nature of that violence. Understanding locations reveals the strategic nature of anti-abolitionist terror. It was deliberate, targeted, and relentless. Newspapers and pamphlets were weapons of influence. In cities and towns, local presses shaped public opinion, often stoking fear and hatred against abolitionists in black communities. Words printed on paper could mobilize a crowd, inflame anger, and justify violence. The pen, in the hands of the hostile, became mightier than the sword. Newspapers often published sensationalized stories, alleged plots by abolitionists to incite slave revolts, claims of Northern conspiracies infiltrating Southern towns, exaggerated accounts of free black communities acting against whites. Fear spread faster than truth, and misinformation fueled mob mentality. Local newspapers did more than report, they directed action. Editorials and opinion pieces warned of dangerous radicals and called citizens to defend property and tradition. Mobs often cited these articles as justification for attacking homes, presses, and abolitionist meetings. Print was both a spark and roadmap for mob violence. Abolitionist presses were frequent targets. Newspapers hostile to abolition spread propaganda labeling them as subversive and dangerous. Riots often erupted shortly after provocative articles appeared in hostile publications. The very medium intended to inform became a tool for destruction. Northern papers were more likely to defend abolitionists, but even there, fear and prejudice persisted. Southern and border state newspapers, however, frequently incited violence, often in coordination with political and economic interests. The geography of press influence mirrored the geography of violence itself. Despite the danger, abolitionists continued to print, distribute, and circulate their message. Underground presses, secret meetings, and discreet pamphlet distribution countered the lies. Every pamphlet printed in secrecy was an act of defiance, courage, and truth. Print could incite terror, but it could also inspire hope and resilience. The mob sought to destroy abolitionists, but in many ways, they strengthened the movement. Violence forced activists to adapt, organize, and strategize in new ways. Secret networks, underground presses, and covert meetings became essential lifelines. The terror that sought to silence them only sharpened their resolve. Abolitionists learned to navigate danger, relocating presses to hidden locations, using secret distribution routes for pamphlets, coordinating with sympathetic allies across states, and sharing intelligence about impending mob attacks. Strategy became survival, and survival became resistance. Ironically, mob attacks united abolitionists. Families, communities, and activists across cities and states coordinated to support one another. Networks that might have been fragile became strong, resilient, and determined. Violence revealed the strength of solidarity, courage, and shared purpose. Mob attacks drew attention both locally and nationally. Reports of violence, martyrdom, and destruction of presses amplified the abolitionist message. Every attack became a story of courage and injustice. Public outrage helped fuel political and social momentum for the movement. The sustained terror taught abolitionists discipline, foresight, and resilience, coordinating in secret, protecting vulnerable communities, and continuing the mission despite threats. Survival required courage, and courage required unity. The mob sought to silence the movement, but they inadvertently created a stronger, more organized, and more determined abolitionist network. Those who faced violence, threats, and exile became symbols of perseverance. The legacy is clear: courage in the face of terror can ignite movements that fear cannot extinguish. 2 decades of mob violence left a scar on communities, families, and individuals. Homes were destroyed, lives were lost, dreams were stolen, and fear became a constant companion, shaping the behavior and speech of entire generations. The cost was immense, but the courage of those who resisted transcended the terror. Mob violence reveals the darkest corners of human psychology. Fear can be weaponized, peer pressure can override morality, groupthink can justify cruelty. Yet, it also shows the strength of resistance, solidarity, and conscience. Mobs were not isolated, they were entwined with politics, religion, and economics. Authorities' inaction, clergy's justification, and financial self-interest enabled terror. Yet, these same pressures forced abolitionists to innovate, organize, and connect. Violence shaped the strategy, resilience, and structure of the abolitionist movement. Rumors, newspapers, and propaganda amplified terror, yet also spread awareness. Every story of destruction became a testament to courage and survival. Words, whether to incite fear or inspire hope, proved as powerful as any weapon. Anti-abolitionist mobs left a legacy of violence, but also of courage. Lessons endure: resistance against injustice requires courage. Solidarity strengthens survival, truth can combat fear. Even in the darkest times, conscience can guide action.